All right. So I've spoken previously about sort of how AI and sort of the new technologies like drones and robotics would be used in warfare, as we're starting to see over the past few years. But I wanted to take actually the opposite approach here and talk about how technologies like AI could actually be used for peacemaking instead. So now I've had an idea sort of about okay, here, let me backtrack a little bit first. So one of the interesting things that I found about building agents with large language models is that you can create simulations of conversations, basically, right? So I'm sure you guys have seen sort of like the AI like podcasts where you got two people, you have two AIs, they're talking to each other, right? And there have been a bunch of really interesting experiments using LLMs to power sort of agent-based modeling type of simulations. And I've actually worked on agent-based modeling before the LLMs started happening, and this was more where you would actually have to program specific logic into each of the agent models, and then you would run it through the simulation. And then they were kind of murky, I guess, in terms of like its usefulness, but it's an interesting framework to play off of, either way, right? Now, since we've got the LLMs that we can basically program in sort of specific ways to approach decision making, this can help us run some more unique types of simulations, right? So one thing that you could potentially do is to simulate the interactions between two people, right? So if you have person A, right, you create an agent that is built upon the information about person A, right? Their background, their experience, knowledge, skills, relationships, culture, etc., right? And then you do the same thing for person B, right? And then basically you put them into like a debate type of situation. Person A has this objective and person B has, their own objective, right? So, and then you let them try to convince the other one, to see things their way, right? And you could run that in loops ad nauseum, right? Now, what this allows for is you can go through these loops, these conversation loops, and then start to try and identify unique points that you might not have thought of, right? Talking points from the other person, perspectives, viewpoints, and considerations that may not have otherwise come up. You may not come up with those naturally, right? So why not apply this to in the areas of like diplomatic negotiations, for example, right? So let's say, for example, you have two countries that are engaged in some sort of a disagreement of any kind, really. It could be an economic disagreement. It could be something about land and borders. It could be all kinds of things, right? It could be cultural disagreements, even ideological disagreements, historical disagreements, right? So right now, the way that goes about it is that you have one side, you have each side that basically goes about their business. They might, have their own strategy, do their own research, and go into some negotiate, and then go back and, in each scenario, they're remaining more or less isolated, with the exception of the times when they are in communication, whether that is, sitting down to meet for a dialogue, or whether there is some sort of electronic communication that happens, via calls and emails, right? Now, because in most forms of government, decision making is made by a select few, right? While there are lots of people who are acting in supporting roles and advising, ultimately the decisions come down to a certain few people, right? In some cases, only one, right? Now, if we were able to go through these sort of simulations and go through sort of what the other team is thinking, and again, try to consider all these different perspectives, garnering these things rather than through speculation, but through agent-based modeling, with AI agents. I definitely think that there are a lot of interesting insights that could be gleaned there. So let's try and work through a few examples here still. Now let's say you want to work through an economic disagreement, right? I think the tariffs kind of thing has been in the news quite a bit, so we could use that one, right? So let's say country A wants to introduce some tariffs, and these are their talking points, right? And then country B wants to respond to that, right? So what would they do? So they could take who is the person in charge of country A and the decision making on the tariffs. Let's make an AI agent of them that encompasses all of their knowledge, experience, their perspectives, their values, as much information as humanly possible. We shouldn't really say humanly possible anymore, eh? So as much information as possible. In this case, right? Because you theoretically be scraping a lot of data, right? So then, you'd want to run through this, list out every single sort of argument that they could possibly make, and put that into a list, right? As to why they want to do this, and get to understand exactly every single point there, right? And go beyond what they're saying and try to figure out what they're thinking, right? Because people will not necessarily tell you everything that they're thinking, right? But if you can design an agent that can take a guess at what the other person is thinking, then while it may be speculative, I think we could probably get a pretty good idea of some of the things that are not being said that are important, right? So then you have this list, right? Then you want to make another agent that's kind of like a research and analysis agent that would go through this list and basically try to figure out the validity of these points, right? So let's say country A is okay, we need to introduce tariffs on all aluminum imports because you guys are not reciprocating on steel or something, right? Or whatever. I'm not really particularly good at this, so bear with me. So you would have the research agent basically go fact check that for what and still, right? Get the numbers, run the numbers, figure out, is this the real deal or not, right? And then try to figure out okay, what's the real problem here? What's the real ask for here still, right? Is there something else that we need to consider that's not being said, that's the actual reason for that? And make a list of those ideas, right? And then you fact check those and you sniff test those, right? And see how those hold up. And already you can see that you're beginning to build a more comprehensive sort of picture of what might actually be going on. Again, beyond the words that are being said, by using data of all different kinds, publicly available market data, for example, in the case of, economic stuff, biographies of these guys that outline their life story, understanding deeper, the web of relationships around these people, right? And this is where it gets really interesting, because you could also start to simulate the conversations that these people are having, right? So let's say, leader of country A has, 20 or 30 some odd very important relationships in their life, right? So then you go ahead and you build agents for those 20 or 30 people, right? Using the exact same process, right? Collecting as much data as you can, knowledge, skills, experience, perspectives, values, objectives, all these things, right? And you try to figure out what might be being said in those conversations, because again, these are not public. Those don't come up in meetings, right? I mean, you'd be surprised how weird the real reasons for things can happen. I'm not gonna get into any conspiracy theories, but I've heard some crazy stuff, let's just say still. Okay, I'll give you one. So apparently back in the 80s, who is it? Barbara Bush. No, not Barbara Bush. It's Nancy Reagan. Sorry, Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan's wife. Apparently, and like I said, I can't confirm this at all, so this is just total hearsay. But apparently, like, she was not being well respected in her role, and she felt that, like, she didn't know what to do about it. So apparently, they are big into astrology, and their astrologer told them that they needed that she needed a purpose, needed a mission or something, right? And then, from having that conversation with an astrologer, and being convinced that she needed to have some sort of a mission, the war on drugs in the 80s was born, right? And that had pretty significant impacts on society and people in the United States, right? And who would have guessed that? That's not nothing that would have been public knowledge, right? And again, like I said, this is hearsay, right? But if you had gone ahead and created an agent that did this sort of same approach, right? And if you could have confirmed that indeed Nancy Reagan did believe in astrology, and that you could look up astrological data of the time and come to the same conclusion that her astrologist did, and then figure out that maybe that was something that she might have heard, then you could bring that into a conversation, maybe before something gets implemented, be like, hey, do you just want to start a war on drugs because because of your astrology, right? And then that could change a lot of things, right? That could change the entire course of history, more or less, right? So definitely some interesting sort of things that could happen there if you have a chance to dive deeper into this. So again, bringing this back to peacemaking, right? So a lot of conflicts are created over misunderstanding, regardless of the significance of the relationship in terms of global impact, right? I mean, you have personal relationships, with your friends, family, significant others, right? And, misunderstandings can cause conflict, right? And it's no different, for relationships of any other size, whether it's heads of state or anywhere in between. So clearing up that communication, again, by any means necessary, is definitely going to at least open up possibilities that didn't exist before. And those could be really positive possibilities, right? So imagine that, let's say you could take this approach, right? And again, you figure out what the other person is actually thinking, right? What are the real issues? What are the what are the hidden elephants of the room that nobody's talking about, that are actually making the impact, and figuring that out quicker, right? Faster, right? Speed, because when it comes to negotiations and all these things, if you don't get the thing done in time, well, that can again have significant impacts, right? You might figure it out, but if you figure it out too late, and something's already been implemented, or you've sort of more or less crossed the Rubicon, you can't roll it back at that point. Well, what's the point, right? So yeah, being able to get that intelligence earlier on in the process, definitely very advantageous still. And again, I think this applies to all manner of different types of relationships, right? So again, let's sort of recap sort of the structure of how this would work. It's where you basically create agents. You program the agents to be as close to the individuals as possible, right? By collecting as much accurate and relevant data, about their experience, their perspectives, their values, skills and knowledge, and their own relationships, creating a web of relationships of these agents, simulating sort of conversations that they might have with each other about specific topics that are of concern, and then simulating the conversations that they would have between the two sort of debating parties. Coming up with these lists of things that would be said, things that may be unsaid, going through a process of research and analysis to fact check them, to understand if they are valid points or not, understand if these points can in fact be reconciled, on prioritizing and rank ordering these lists, by importance, and then using all of that data to synthesize a plan of action. And you can do that pretty fast overall still. Once you build the infrastructure, like the software infrastructure to support all of these agents, it would only maybe take like a day or so to run all of the simulations and to come up with that final report. And that's the kind of speed that could change the course of these relationships, right? No matter how big or small. So, food for thought again. Hope you guys enjoyed it. We'll see you in the next one.